I realized something was wrong the moment I saw Patricia Henderson standing on my front lawn with her phone pointed at my fence like she was documenting a crime scene. It was a Tuesday morning in Boulder, Colorado, and I had just gotten home from an early inspection job downtown. I work as a building inspector for the city, which means I spend my days checking construction sites, reviewing permits, and making sure everything meets code requirements. It's not the most exciting job in the world, but it pays the bills and keeps me busy. What I didn't expect was for my work life and home life to collide in the most absurd way possible. Patricia was the president of our neighborhood HOA, the Sunrise Valley Homeowners Association, and she'd been a thorn in my side since I moved into this house 3 years ago. She was one of those middle-aged women who seemed to have infinite time to police everyone else's property, while her own yard looked like it hadn't been maintained since the Reagan administration. Her blonde hair was always pulled back so tight it looked painful, and she wore the same style of khaki capris and polo shirts like it was some kind of uniform. "Good morning, Patricia," I called out as I stepped out of my truck, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Can I help you with something?" She didn't even look up from her phone. "I'm documenting violations, Quincy. Your fence is at least 3 inches too tall according to the HOA bylaws. I've already filed a complaint with the building department." I felt my jaw tighten. The fence in question was a beautiful cedar privacy fence I'd installed myself 6 months ago. I'd pulled the permits, done all the measurements, and made absolutely certain it met every single requirement in the Boulder Building Code. It was exactly 6 feet tall, which was the maximum height allowed for a backyard fence in our zone. I'd even gone the extra mile and made sure the finished side faced outward toward the neighbors, which wasn't required but was considered good practice. "Patricia, that fence is exactly 6 feet tall. I measured it myself multiple times. It's completely up to code." She finally looked up, her thin lips pressed into a disapproving line. "The HOA bylaws state that fences cannot exceed 5 feet 9 inches. You're in violation, and I've already reported it. You'll be hearing from the building department within the next few days, and you'll be required to modify or remove the fence entirely. Plus, you'll be facing fines from the HOA for each day it remains in violation." I took a deep breath, counting to 10 in my head. "The building code supersedes HOA bylaws, Patricia. As long as the fence meets city code, which it does, the HOA can't force me to change it." "We'll see about that," she said, that smug expression on her face that I'd come to know so well. "The building department will be sending an inspector out, and when they confirm the violation, you'll have no choice but to comply." She turned on her heel and marched back across the street to her own house, leaving me standing there with a mix of anger and disbelief churning in my gut. This wasn't the first time Patricia had targeted me. Last year, she tried to fine me because my grass was supposedly a 1/4 inch too long. The year before that, she'd complained that the color of my front door wasn't on the approved HOA color palette, even though I'd checked the bylaws and confirmed that the deep blue I'd chosen was explicitly listed. I walked over to my fence and ran my hand along the smooth cedar planks. It really was a nice fence. I'd spent 2 full weekends building it, and I was proud of the work. The posts were set in concrete, the boards were level and evenly spaced, and everything was sturdy and well constructed. There was absolutely nothing wrong with it. Inside my house, I grabbed a beer from the fridge and sat down at the kitchen table. My phone buzzed with a text from my buddy Marcus, who lived 2 streets over in the same neighborhood. "Heard Patricia is on the warpath again. What did you do this time?" I texted back. "Apparently my fence is too tall. She reported it to the building department." His response came quickly. "Lol. Doesn't she know what you do for a living? That was the kicker. Patricia had no idea I was a building inspector. I'd never mentioned it to her, and it had simply never come up in our limited interactions. She knew I worked for the city in some capacity, but that was about it. Most of my neighbors didn't know exactly what I did. It wasn't something I advertised, partly because I didn't want to be the guy everyone asked for free advice at neighborhood barbecues. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Patricia had reported my fence to the building department, and there was a very good chance that I would be the one assigned to inspect it. The building department had 5 inspectors, and we rotated through complaints and permit inspections based on a schedule and geographic zones. My zone included my own neighborhood. I spent the rest of the evening trying not to think about it, but Wednesday morning when I arrived at the office, there it was sitting in my queue. Complaint number 248756, fence height violation at 2847 Maple Ridge Drive. My address. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then walked over to my supervisor's office. Tom Reynolds was a grizzled veteran who'd been with the building department for 30 years. He looked up from his computer as I knocked on his doorframe. "Tom, we've got a situation," I said, explaining the complaint about my own property. He leaned back in his chair, a slow grin spreading across his face. "So let me get this straight. Your HOA president reported your fence, not knowing that you're the inspector who would likely handle it." "Exactly, and the fence is completely up to code. I built it myself 6 months ago with a valid permit." Tom pulled up the complaint on his computer and read through it. "Okay, here's what we're going to do. You're going to handle this inspection by the book, just like any other complaint. Document everything, take photos, write up your report. If the fence is up to code, which I'm sure it is knowing you, then you close the complaint as unfounded. The HOA doesn't get to override building code with their bylaws." "You're sure? I mean, isn't there a conflict of interest?" "Normally, yes. But in this case you're the inspector for that zone, and the complaint is about whether the structure meets code, which is objective and measurable. If you're concerned, I can have Jerry from Zone 3 handle it, but honestly I think it'll be more educational for your HOA president if you handle it yourself." I thought about it for a moment. "I'll handle it, but I want everything documented perfectly so there's no question about bias." "Agreed. Do it right, Quincy. I'll review your report personally before it gets filed." That afternoon, I drove home early and spent 2 hours doing the most thorough fence inspection I'd ever conducted in my career. I took photos from every angle. I measured the height at multiple points along the fence line with 2 different tape measures to confirm accuracy. I checked the setback from the property line. I verified that the posts were properly spaced and that the structure was stable. I reviewed the original permit I'd pulled 6 months ago and confirmed that everything matched the approved plans. The fence was exactly 6 feet tall, not an inch more. It was set back the required 3 feet from the side property line. The posts were properly embedded in concrete. The gates functioned correctly and didn't sag. Every single aspect of the fence met or exceeded the requirements in the Boulder Building Code. I was in the middle of taking measurements when I heard Patricia's voice behind me. "Oh good, they sent an inspector already." "I'm Patricia Henderson, the HOA president. I'm the one who filed the complaint." I turned around slowly, my measuring tape still in hand. "I know who you are, Patricia. We're neighbors." Her eyes widened slightly as recognition dawned on her face. "Quincy, you're the building inspector." "I am. Have been for 8 years now. And I have to tell you, this fence is completely up to code. It's exactly 6 feet tall, which is the maximum height allowed for a residential privacy fence in this zone. All the measurements are proper. It was permitted correctly. and there are no violations. Her face went through several interesting color changes, settling somewhere between pink and purple. But the HOA bylaws clearly state that fences cannot exceed 5 feet 9 inches. I pulled out my tablet and brought up the relevant section of the building code. Mrs. Henderson, HOA bylaws cannot supersede municipal building codes. If the building code allows 6 feet, then a homeowner has the right to build to 6 feet regardless of what the HOA bylaws say. The most the HOA can do is petition the city to change the code, but that's a lengthy process involving city council meetings and public comment periods. That's ridiculous. The HOA has the right to maintain standards in the neighborhood. The HOA has the right to enforce reasonable restrictions that don't conflict with building codes or state law. A restriction that contradicts the building code isn't enforceable. I'm going to be closing this complaint as unfounded because there are no code violations present. Patricia's hands were shaking slightly, and I could see the anger building in her expression. This is a conflict of interest. You can't inspect your own property. Actually, I can when the complaint is objective and measurable, which this is. But if you'd like, I can have my supervisor come out and verify my findings. I can also provide you with the contact information for the building department if you want to file an appeal, though I should warn you that it won't change anything. The fence is legal. She sputtered for a moment, clearly trying to find an argument that would work. The other neighbors have complained too. They say it's an eyesore. The aesthetic preferences of neighbors aren't relevant to code compliance, and frankly, Patricia, I did everything by the book. I made sure the finished side faces outward, which isn't required but is considered courteous. The fence is well built, attractive, and completely legal. We'll see about that, she snapped, turning and marching back toward her house. I finished my inspection, compiled my report with all the photos and measurements, and submitted it to Tom for review. He approved it the next morning, and the complaint was officially closed as unfounded. I thought that would be the end of it, but I severely underestimated Patricia's determination. The following week, I received a certified letter from the Sunrise Valley HOA. Inside was a notice of violation and a fine schedule. According to the letter, I was in violation of HOA bylaw section 7.3.2 regarding fence height, and I was being fined $500. Furthermore, if I didn't modify the fence within 30 days, I would be fined an additional $100 per day until compliance was achieved. I sat at my kitchen table reading the letter 3 times, my blood pressure rising with each pass. This was absolutely insane. The building department had officially determined that there was no violation, but the HOA was proceeding with fines anyway. I called Tom at the office. They're trying to fine me $500 for a fence that you and I both confirmed is completely legal. Can they do that? Tom asked. Technically, they can fine me according to their bylaws, but those fines aren't enforceable if they're based on requirements that conflict with building codes. I'm going to have to fight this, probably in court. Document everything, Tom advised. Keep copies of all correspondence, save the inspection report, take photos. If this goes to court, you'll want a paper trail. I spent that evening digging through the HOA bylaws, which I admittedly hadn't read thoroughly when I bought the house. What I found was troubling. The bylaws gave the HOA board broad authority to levy fines and enforce compliance, but they also included a clause that allowed homeowners to appeal decisions to the full board. I decided to start there before lawyering up. I submitted my appeal in writing, citing the building code, including copies of the inspection report and photographs, and requesting a hearing before the full HOA board. The bylaws stated that the board had to schedule such a hearing within 30 days of receiving an appeal. 3 weeks later, I received a notice that the board meeting would be held on a Thursday evening at the community center. I was given 15 minutes to present my case. The Thursday of the meeting, I arrived at the community center with a laptop, a portable projector, and a folder full of documentation. The community center was a small building near the neighborhood entrance, with a meeting room that could hold about 50 people. When I walked in, I was surprised to see at least 20 of my neighbors already seated. The HOA board sat at a long table at the front of the room. Patricia was in the center seat, flanked by 4 other board members I recognized from the neighborhood. There was Derek Williams, a retired accountant who lived on Oak Street; Susan Martinez, who ran a real estate office downtown; Robert Chen, a lawyer who worked for a corporate firm; and Brenda Kowalski, who I'd only met once at a neighborhood barbecue. Patricia called the meeting to order and went through some routine business first, approving minutes from the last meeting and discussing upcoming neighborhood events. Then she got to my appeal. Our next item is an appeal from Quincy Crawford regarding a fence violation at 2847 Maple Ridge Drive. Mr. Crawford, you have 15 minutes to present your case. I stood up and walked to the front of the room, connecting my laptop to the projector. Thank you. I'm appealing the violation notice and fine because my fence is completely compliant with Boulder Building Code. The building department has already inspected the fence and closed the complaint as unfounded because no violations exist. I pulled up the first photo on the projector, showing the fence from the street. This is a 6-foot cedar privacy fence that I installed 6 months ago with a valid building permit. The maximum height allowed by city code for a residential privacy fence in our zone is 6 feet. My fence measures exactly 6 feet at multiple points along its length. I clicked through several photos showing me measuring the fence height with a tape measure. As you can see here, the fence is precisely 6 feet tall. I measured it at 10 different points to ensure accuracy. Patricia interrupted. The HOA bylaws state that fences cannot exceed 5 feet 9 inches. Your fence violates that restriction. I understand that's what the bylaws state, but HOA bylaws cannot supersede municipal building codes. This is established case law in Colorado. In the case of Beachside Homeowners Association versus Martinez, the Colorado Court of Appeals ruled that HOA restrictions that directly conflict with building codes are unenforceable. I have copies of that decision if the board would like to review it. I handed out copies of the relevant court decision to each board member. Robert Chen, the lawyer, started reading it immediately, his brow furrowed. Furthermore, I continued, I work as a building inspector for the city of Boulder. I conducted the inspection of the complaint that was filed, and I can professionally attest that this fence meets all code requirements. My supervisor reviewed and approved my findings. Susan Martinez leaned forward. Wait, you're a building inspector. You inspected your own property. Yes, because the complaint fell within my inspection zone. However, my supervisor Tom Reynolds reviewed all of my findings and approved the report. If the board has any doubts about the accuracy of the inspection, I can provide contact information for the building department, and you can request verification. There was murmuring among the board members and in the audience. Several neighbors were whispering to each other. Patricia's face was red. This still doesn't change the fact that the fence violates our bylaws. Robert Chen looked up from the court decision. Actually, Patricia, if this precedent is applicable, we can't enforce a bylaw that conflicts with building code. The homeowner has the right to build to code specifications. That's absurd, Patricia said. We have to be able to maintain standards in the neighborhood. I understand the desire to maintain standards, I said, keeping my voice calm and professional. But the HOA's authority has limits. You can't require homeowners to violate building codes or forfeit their legal rights. If the board believes the building code should be changed, that's a matter to take up with City Council, not individual homeowners. Derek Williams spoke up for the first time. How much did you say the fines were, Patricia? $500 initially, then $100 per day after 30 days, Patricia said. That seems excessive for a offense that's apparently legal, Derek said. I move that we dismiss the violation and rescind the fine. I second that motion, Susan Martinez said. Patricia looked like she'd been slapped. You can't be serious. I am serious, Derek said. We can't fine someone for following building codes. It's not just legally questionable, it's wrong. All in favor of dismissing the violation. 3 hands went up, Derek, Susan, and Robert. Brenda Kowalski abstained. Patricia was the only vote against. Motion carries, Derek said. The violation is dismissed and the fine is rescinded. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Thank you. I appreciate the board taking the time to review this carefully. As I packed up my laptop, several neighbors came up to talk to me. Marcus, my friend from 2 streets over, clapped me on the shoulder. That was epic, man. Patricia's face when she realized you were the inspector was priceless. An older woman named Helen, who lived across the street from Patricia, smiled at me. It's about time someone stood up to her. She's been terrorizing this neighborhood for years with her petty complaints. But as I left the community center that night, I had a feeling this wasn't over. Patricia Henderson didn't strike me as the type to let things go. I was proven right 2 weeks later when I came home to find a notice taped to my front door. The HOA had filed a lawsuit against me in Boulder County Court, seeking an injunction to force me to modify the fence and pay the original fines plus legal fees. I sat in my living room that night, staring at the lawsuit papers in disbelief. This had gone from annoying to genuinely expensive. I was going to need a lawyer, and even if I won, which I was confident I would, the time and money involved was going to be substantial. The next morning, I called a real estate attorney named Jennifer Lawson who a colleague had recommended. She agreed to meet with me that afternoon. Jennifer's office was in a renovated Victorian house near downtown Boulder. She was in her 40s, with short dark hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. I laid out the whole situation for her, providing copies of all the documentation. This is pretty straightforward, she said after reviewing everything. The HOA doesn't have a leg to stand on legally. The building code supersedes their bylaws, and you have documentation from the building department confirming compliance. The question is whether we want to just defend against their suit or go on the offensive. What do you mean, offensive? Well, you could countersue for harassment, legal fees, and potentially damages. Colorado law allows for recovery of attorney fees in HOA disputes if the HOA is found to be acting unreasonably. And frankly, continuing to pursue this after a building inspector confirmed the fence is legal is pretty unreasonable. I thought about it. Part of me just wanted this to go away, but another part was angry at the waste of time and money Patricia was putting me through. Let's defend and countersue. I want this on record so she can't pull this with other homeowners. Good. I'll file our response and counterclaim next week. The lawsuit wound its way through the court system for the next 3 months. During that time, Patricia seemed to ramp up her scrutiny of my property. I got notices about my trash cans being visible from the street 15 minutes before the collection truck arrived. She complained that my car was parked on the street overnight, even though there was no bylaw prohibiting that. She tried to fine me because a package delivery box sat on my porch for 3 hours before I got home from work to retrieve it. Each complaint I documented carefully, keeping a log with dates, times, and descriptions. Jennifer said it was all helping our harassment case. Finally, in late March, we had our day in court. The hearing was scheduled before Judge Richard Morrison in Boulder County Court. It was a civil matter, so there was no jury, just the judge reviewing the facts and making a ruling. The HOA was represented by a lawyer named Paul Stevenson, who I learned was being paid with HOA dues, which meant my own dues were funding a lawsuit against me. That added another layer of irritation to the whole situation. Judge Morrison was an older man with gray hair and reading glasses perched on his nose. He reviewed the case file before calling us to order. "I've read the briefs from both parties," he said. "This seems like a fairly straightforward matter. Mr. Stevenson, you're arguing that your client, the HOA, has the authority to enforce a fence height restriction that's more stringent than the building code." "Yes, Your Honor," Stevenson said, standing up. "The HOA bylaws clearly state that fences cannot exceed 5 feet 9 inches in height. Mr. Crawford agreed to abide by these bylaws when he purchased his home. The bylaws are a private contract, and we believe they should be enforced." "Miss Lawson," the judge said, turning to my attorney. Jennifer stood. "Your Honor, while it's true that HOA bylaws are generally enforceable as private contracts, they cannot require homeowners to violate or forfeit rights granted by municipal building codes. The Colorado Court of Appeals established this principle in Beachside Homeowners Association versus Martinez. Additionally, my client's fence was inspected by the Boulder Building Department and found to be in full compliance with all applicable codes. The HOA is essentially trying to force my client to modify a legal structure which exceeds their authority." Judge Morrison nodded. "I'm familiar with the Beachside case. Mr. Stevenson, how do you distinguish your case from that precedent?" Stevenson shuffled his papers. "Your Honor, in the Beachside case, the HOA was trying to prevent the homeowner from building a structure that was permitted by code. In this case, the homeowner could have chosen to build a fence that complied with both code and the bylaws. He chose not to." "That's a distinction without a difference," Jennifer countered. "The building code gives homeowners the right to build to certain specifications. An HOA cannot penalize a homeowner for exercising that right. It's no different than if the HOA tried to prevent someone from adding a second story to their house because they preferred single-story homes, even though the building code allows 2 stories. The judge thought for a moment. "I'm inclined to agree with Miss Lawson. Mr. Crawford had the legal right to build a 6-foot fence. The HOA cannot override that right with a more restrictive bylaw. I'm going to rule in favor of the defendant and dismiss the HOA's complaint." Patricia, who was sitting in the gallery behind her attorney, made a noise of frustration. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I'm granting the defendant's counterclaim for attorney fees and costs. The HOA will be responsible for Mr. Crawford's legal expenses in defending this action. I'm also issuing a permanent injunction preventing the HOA from attempting to fine or penalize Mr. Crawford for the fence in question." I felt Jennifer squeeze my arm in celebration, but I kept my expression neutral. The judge wasn't done. "However, I want to address something else that concerns me. Miss Lawson, your counterclaim includes allegations of harassment. Can you elaborate on that?" Jennifer stood again. "Yes, Your Honor. Since this dispute began, the HOA president, Mrs. Henderson, has filed numerous frivolous complaints against my client. We have documentation of at least 8 separate complaints in the past 3 months, all of which were either not actual violations or were so minor as to be absurd. For example, Mr. Crawford was fined for having his trash cans visible from the street for 15 minutes before collection. We believe this constitutes a pattern of harassment. The judge turned to look directly at Patricia. Mrs. Henderson, are you the HOA president? Patricia stood up, her face red. Yes, Your Honor. And did you personally file these complaints against Mr. Crawford? I was doing my job, Your Honor. As HOA president, I'm responsible for enforcing the bylaws. There's a difference between enforcing bylaws and harassing residents. I'm ordering the HOA to cease all targeted enforcement actions against Mr. Crawford. If there are legitimate violations in the future, they need to be handled through normal channels, and I expect them to be treated the same as violations by any other homeowner. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Your Honor, Patricia said quietly, sitting back down. We walked out of the courthouse an hour later after finalizing some paperwork. Jennifer was grinning. That went about as well as it could have. The HOA is going to owe you about $8,000 in legal fees. They'll probably pay it from the general HOA fund, which means everyone's dues will go toward covering it. I almost feel bad about that, I said. My neighbors shouldn't have to pay for Patricia's vendetta. Don't feel too bad. Maybe it'll motivate them to replace her at the next election. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in months. The fence was officially and permanently legal. Patricia couldn't harass me anymore, and the whole thing was behind me, or so I thought. That evening, I was grilling burgers in my backyard when Marcus came through the gate. Dude, have you seen the neighborhood Facebook group? I shook my head. I don't really follow it. Why? He pulled out his phone and showed me. Patricia had posted a long rant about how I had corrupted the justice system by using my position as a building inspector to intimidate the HOA. She claimed the judge was biased, that the lawsuit had been rigged, and that I was a danger to property values in the neighborhood. She's losing it, Marcus said. Half the comments are people telling her to let it go. The other half are people saying they're glad someone finally stood up to her. I read through some of the comments. Marcus was right. The neighborhood seemed split, but more people were supporting me than I expected. Several neighbors shared their own stories of Patricia's overzealous enforcement actions. One family had been fined for having a vegetable garden that was supposedly visible from the street. Another had been cited because their teenage son's car was too old and decrepit, even though it was just a normal used sedan. She's making enemies, I said. This might actually work out in everyone's favor if it motivates people to vote her out. What I didn't expect was for Patricia to escalate things even further. The following Tuesday, I got a call at work from a detective with the Boulder Police Department. Detective Sarah Reeves wanted to meet with me about a complaint that had been filed. What kind of complaint? I asked, confused. I'd rather discuss it in person. Can you come to the station this afternoon? I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Am I being accused of something? I just need to ask you some questions. You're not under arrest, but I think it would be good for us to talk. I told Tom what was happening, and he immediately offered to come with me. We drove to the police station together, both of us trying to figure out what this could possibly be about. Detective Reeves met us in a small conference room. She was in her 30s, with pulled-back brown hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. Thanks for coming in, Mr. Crawford. I'm investigating a complaint filed by Patricia Henderson. She's alleging that you falsified a building inspection report to cover up code violations on your property. I stared at her in disbelief. That's absolutely not true. My supervisor reviewed the inspection. The fence is completely legal. We just went through this in court, and the judge ruled in my favor. "I'm aware of the court case," Detective Reeves said, "but Mrs. Henderson is claiming that you abused your position as a building inspector for personal gain. That's a serious allegation that I have to investigate." Tom leaned forward. "Detective, I'm Quincy's supervisor. I personally reviewed his inspection report on the fence in question. Everything was by the book. The fence meets all code requirements." This is clearly a case of someone trying to weaponize the legal system because they didn't get their way in court. Detective Reeves nodded. "I tend to agree with you, but I need to document everything. Mr. Crawford, do you have copies of the inspection report and all related documentation?" "I have everything on my work laptop. I can provide you with copies of the entire file." Over the next hour, I walked Detective Reeves through the entire situation. I showed her the original complaint, the inspection photos, the measurements, the permit records, and the court ruling. Tom provided a written statement confirming that he'd reviewed and approved my work. "This is pretty clear-cut," Detective Reeves said finally. "There's no evidence of any wrongdoing on your part. However, I am concerned about Mrs. Henderson's behavior. Filing a false police report is a crime. Making false accusations of official misconduct is a crime. I think I need to have a conversation with her." "I don't want to press charges," I said quickly. "I just want this to be over. I understand, but this has gone beyond a civil dispute. She's wasting police resources with false allegations. At minimum, I need to make clear to her that this behavior needs to stop." Tom and I left the police station, and I felt exhausted. This had consumed so much of my time and energy over the past few months, all because of a perfectly legal fence. 2 days later, Marcus texted me again. "Patricia got visited by the cops. She's posting about it on Facebook, claiming she's being persecuted." I checked the neighborhood Facebook group and found Patricia's post. She'd written a long, rambling message about how the police had harassed her and how I had weaponized law enforcement against her. The comments section was even more divided than before. Some people were sympathetic to Patricia, but many others were calling her out for making false accusations. One comment caught my eye. It was from Helen, the older woman who'd spoken to me after the board meeting. "Patricia, you need to stop. You've been harassing Quincy for months over a fence that multiple authorities have confirmed is legal. You filed a frivolous lawsuit that cost the HOA thousands of dollars. Now you're making false police reports. As a longtime resident of this neighborhood, I'm embarrassed by your behavior. It's time to resign from the board." The comment had over 40 likes, which in our small neighborhood Facebook group was significant. The next evening, there was an emergency HOA board meeting. I didn't plan to attend, but Derek Williams, the board member who'd voted to dismiss my original violation, called me and asked me to be there. "We're voting on whether to remove Patricia as president," he explained. "The board can do it with a majority vote. I think it would be helpful if you were there to answer any questions about what happened." I reluctantly agreed and showed up at the community center at 7. The parking lot was packed, and when I walked into the meeting room, it was standing room only. Apparently, word had gotten around that this was going to be an interesting meeting. The board sat at their usual table, but Patricia's center seat was empty. She was sitting in the front row of the audience, her arms crossed, and her expression stormy. Derek, as vice president, called the meeting to order. "We're here tonight to discuss a motion to remove Patricia Henderson as president of the Sunrise Valley HOA board. This motion was brought by board members after recent events that we believe demonstrate conduct unbecoming of the office." He went on to detail the lawsuit, the costs to the HOA, the false police report, and the general pattern of behavior. Patricia tried to interrupt several times, but Derek firmly told her she'd have a chance to speak. When Derek finished, Patricia stood up. "This is a witch hunt." I was doing my job as HOA president. Mr. Crawford violated the bylaws, and I took appropriate action to enforce them. The fact that a corrupt judge ruled against the HOA doesn't change that. Robert Chen, the lawyer on the board, shook his head. "Patricia, the judge wasn't corrupt. The law is clear. You pushed forward with enforcement action on something that wasn't enforceable. Then you doubled down by filing a lawsuit that cost the HOA $8,000. Then you filed a false police report. That's not doing your job. That's harassment." The vote was called. 4 board members voted to remove Patricia as president: Derek, Susan, Robert, and Brenda. Patricia was the only vote against. "The motion carries," Derek said. "Patricia Henderson is removed as president of the Sunrise Valley HOA board, effective immediately. Per the bylaws, I will assume the role of president until the next scheduled election." Patricia stood up, her face purple with rage. "This is illegal. You can't just remove me." "Actually, we can," Robert said calmly. "It's in the bylaws, section 12.4. A board member can be removed for cause by a majority vote of the board. Cause includes conduct that damages the HOA financially or reputationally, which your actions have clearly done." Patricia grabbed her purse and stormed out of the community center. Several people in the audience actually applauded, though Derek quickly called for order. After the meeting, multiple neighbors came up to thank me for standing my ground. Helen, the older woman, gave me a hug. "You did the whole neighborhood a favor." Patricia has been making everyone miserable for years. Maybe now we can have an HOA that actually works for the residents instead of against them. I drove home that night feeling like a weight had been lifted. It had been a long, stressful battle, but it was finally over. The next few weeks were blissfully quiet. No complaints, no letters, no drama. I focused on my work and enjoyed my backyard with its perfectly legal 6-foot fence. Then, in early May, Marcus texted me with a screenshot. "You need to see this." It was a post from a real estate listing site. Patricia's house was for sale. "She's moving," I texted back. "Looks like it." I guess she decided the neighborhood wasn't for her anymore. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me was relieved that the source of all the conflict was leaving, but another part felt almost sorry for Patricia. She'd become so consumed with enforcing rules and maintaining control that she'd alienated herself from the entire community. A few weeks later, I saw a moving truck in front of Patricia's house. I was tempted to just ignore it and let her leave without acknowledgement, but something made me walk across the street. Patricia was directing the movers, looking tired and defeated. When she saw me approaching, her expression hardened. "I'm not here to gloat," I said before she could say anything. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry it came to all this." She was quiet for a long moment. "Are you really? You got everything you wanted. You kept your fence. You got me removed from the board, and now I'm leaving." "I never wanted any of this, Patricia. I just wanted to have a legal fence in my backyard. You're the one who kept escalating." She looked away. "I was just trying to maintain standards. This used to be such a nice neighborhood." "It still is a nice neighborhood, but people have legal rights and the HOA can't override those. If you just let it go after the building inspection, none of this would have happened." "Maybe," she said quietly, "but I couldn't let it go. I thought I was right. Even when the judge told you otherwise, even when the police investigated your complaint and found nothing." She didn't answer, just turned back to supervise the movers. I walked back to my house, and that was the last conversation I ever had with Patricia Henderson. The following month, Derek organized a neighborhood barbecue at the community center. It was the first big social event the HOA had sponsored in years, and the turnout was impressive. People actually seemed to enjoy each other's company without the constant undercurrent of worry about whether someone was going to report them for a minor infraction. I stood near my truck with Marcus, a beer in hand, watching kids play on the community center lawn. "You know what's funny?" Marcus said. "All of this drama was over 3 inches. I laughed. 3 inches that didn't even matter because the building code allowed it. So what are you going to do with all your newfound freedom? No more HOA complaints, no more lawsuits." "Honestly, I'm thinking about building a deck. I've been wanting one for years." "Please tell me it's going to be up to code," Marcus said with a grin. "Not just up to code. It's going to be the most meticulously code-compliant deck in Boulder County. I'll probably over-engineer it just to be safe." "That's the spirit. And hey, at least if anyone complains, you can inspect it yourself." We both laughed at that. A young couple who'd recently moved into Patricia's old house came over to introduce themselves. Their names were Frank and Felicity Graham, and they seemed genuinely nice. Frank was a software engineer, and Felicity taught middle school science. "We heard there was some drama with the previous owner," Frank said. "Something about an HOA dispute, water under the bridge," I said diplomatically. "Welcome to the neighborhood. You're going to like it here." And the truth was, I meant it. With Patricia gone and Derek running the HOA with a much lighter touch, the neighborhood had become a genuinely pleasant place to live. People weren't afraid of their neighbors anymore. The Facebook group had transformed from a complaint forum into an actual community resource where people shared recipes and organized playdates. In June, the HOA held its annual election. Derek ran for president officially and won in a landslide. He immediately pushed through several changes to the bylaws, including a clause that explicitly stated HOA restrictions could not conflict with building codes, and another that required any fines over $100 to be approved by the full board rather than just the president. I was sitting in my backyard on a Saturday afternoon in July, enjoying the privacy that my perfectly legal 6-foot fence provided when my phone rang. It was Tom from work. "Hey Quincy, got a weird question for you. Do you remember that whole situation with your fence and your HOA?" "How could I forget?" "Well, I just got a call from an HOA in Denver. They're dealing with a similar situation. Homeowner built a deck to code, but the HOA is saying it violates their bylaws. They heard about your case and want to know if you'd be willing to talk to the homeowner, maybe provide some guidance." I thought about it for a moment. The whole experience had been stressful and time-consuming, but I'd learned a lot about HOA law and homeowner rights. If I could help someone else avoid the same nightmare, maybe something good could come from it all. "Sure, I'll talk to them. Send me their contact info." Over the next few months, I ended up consulting on 3 different HOA disputes, all involving situations where the HOA was trying to enforce restrictions that conflicted with building codes. Word had spread in the building inspector community about my case, and I'd become something of an unofficial expert on the subject. In September, I was invited to speak at a state conference for building inspectors about the intersection of HOA bylaws and building codes. Standing at the podium in front of 200 fellow inspectors, I told the story of my fence saga. "The key takeaway," I concluded, "is that building codes exist for a reason. They're minimum standards for safety and construction quality. HOAs can't require homeowners to build below those standards, and they can't penalize homeowners for building to code. As inspectors, we need to be aware of this issue because we're often the ones who have to defend the code when conflicts arise." The speech was well received, and several inspectors came up afterward to share their own stories of HOA conflicts. It seemed my situation was far from unique. By the time October rolled around, my fence had been up for over a year. The cedar had weathered to a beautiful silver gray that blended perfectly with the landscape. I'd built that deck I'd been planning, also exactly to code specifications, and it had become my favorite place to spend weekend mornings with coffee and a book. One Saturday morning, Helen from across the street knocked on my gate. "Quincy, do you have a minute? Of course, come on back." She stepped onto the deck and smiled approvingly. "This is lovely. You did nice work." "Thanks. What can I help you with?" "Well, I'm thinking about having my driveway repaved, and I wanted to ask your professional opinion about contractors. I know you must work with a lot of them through your inspections." We spent a pleasant half hour discussing contractors and permits. As Helen was leaving, she paused at the gate. "You know, when Patricia was in charge, I never would have felt comfortable asking for help like this. Everyone was so worried about being reported for something that we stopped talking to each other. It's nice to have a real neighborhood again." After she left, I sat back down on my deck and looked at the fence that had caused so much trouble. It really was just a fence. 6 feet of cedar planks, nothing special. But it had become a symbol of something larger, a line in the sand about what was reasonable and what wasn't, about legal rights versus neighborhood rules. I thought about Patricia sometimes, wondered where she'd moved to and whether she'd learned anything from the experience. I hoped she had, but I wasn't optimistic. Some people are so convinced of their own righteousness that they can't see when they've gone too far. The following spring, I was doing a routine inspection on a new construction site when I ran into an old colleague from my early days in the building department. His name was Greg, and he'd moved to a different city years ago but was back in Boulder for a project. "Quincy Crawford, is that you?" He called out. "I heard about your famous fence case. That was you, right?" I laughed. "Yeah, that was me. I didn't realize it had spread that far." "Are you kidding? It's taught as an example in some continuing education courses now. You're like a folk hero for building inspectors everywhere." "I don't know about that. I just didn't want to tear down a perfectly good fence." "Well, you did us all a service. HOAs have been running roughshod over building codes for years. Someone needed to push back." As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how the whole experience had changed my perspective on my job. I'd always taken pride in my work, but I'd viewed it as fairly routine and unglamorous. Now, I saw it differently. Building codes weren't just bureaucratic rules. They were rights and protections for homeowners. My job wasn't just checking measurements and looking at permits. It was defending those rights when they were challenged. In late May, almost 2 years after the whole saga began, I got an unexpected piece of mail. It was a letter from Patricia Henderson, forwarded from her old address to mine by the new owners. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened it carefully. The letter was handwritten, which surprised me. Patricia's handwriting was neat and precise, just like everything else about her. "Dear Quincy," it began. "I've been thinking about writing this letter for months, and I finally decided I should. I want to apologize for how I treated you and for the stress I caused. I was wrong, both about the fence and about how I handled the situation. I let my need to control things spiral out of control, and I hurt people in the process. You weren't the only one. I've been in therapy since I moved, working through some issues, and I'm starting to see how unreasonable I was. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I'm genuinely sorry. I hope you're enjoying your home and your fence. Patricia." I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it in a drawer. I wasn't sure how I felt about it. The apology seemed genuine, but it didn't change what had happened. Still, I appreciated that she'd made the effort. A few weeks later, I wrote back. I kept it brief. I thanked her for the apology, told her I accepted it, and wished her well in her new location. I didn't know if she'd respond, and she never did, but it felt like the right thing to do. The summer of that year was peaceful. The neighborhood continued to thrive under Derek's leadership. The Facebook group organized a summer concert series in the community center parking lot. Kids rode bikes in the streets without parents worrying that someone would complain about noise. People actually talked to each other again. Frank and Felicity, the couple who'd bought Patricia's house, became good friends of mine. Frank was a beer enthusiast, and we started brewing together in my garage. Felicity organized a neighborhood garden club that turned the common area near the entrance into a beautiful display of native plants. One evening in August, I was sitting on my deck with Marcus, burgers on the grill and cold beers in hand. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "You know what I just realized?" Marcus said. "We're sitting here drinking beer in your backyard, completely blocked from view by your fence, and there's nobody worrying about whether it's legal or who's going to complain." I raised my beer. "To legal fences and reasonable neighbors." "To legal fences," Marcus echoed, clinking his bottle against mine. In September, Derek asked me to join the HOA board. There was an open seat after Brenda Kowalski moved to Denver for a job, and he thought my expertise would be valuable. I was hesitant at first. After everything that had happened, the idea of being involved in HOA governance didn't exactly appeal to me. But Derek convinced me that the best way to prevent another Patricia situation was to have board members who understood the limits of HOA authority and respected homeowner rights. I agreed and was appointed to fill the vacant seat. It wasn't a dramatic role. Mostly, I reviewed architectural requests and provided input on whether proposed projects would meet building codes. But I took satisfaction in knowing that I could help other homeowners avoid the nightmare I'd gone through. In my first month on the board, we dealt with a request from a homeowner who wanted to install solar panels. The old bylaws had some vague language about roof modifications that could have been interpreted to prohibit or restrict solar installations. I worked with Robert, the lawyer on the board, to update the bylaws to explicitly allow solar panels as long as they met building codes and safety requirements. We also added language clarifying that the HOA would defer to building codes on technical matters, rather than trying to impose our own standards. It felt good to be part of making the HOA better rather than fighting against it. By the time winter rolled around, my fence had been standing for 2.5 years. It had weathered storms, snow, and sun. It was still solid, still level, still exactly 6 feet tall, and still completely legal. I was shoveling snow from my driveway on a Saturday morning in December when a car pulled up. A young woman in her 20s got out, looking nervous. "Excuse me, are you Quincy Crawford?" "I am. Can I help you?" "My name is Amy Peterson. I live over in the Meadowbrook neighborhood. I heard about what happened with your fence and your HOA. I'm dealing with something similar. My HOA is trying to fine me for painting my front door red, even though there's no rule about door colors in the bylaws. They're just making it up as they go along. I was hoping you could give me some advice." I invited her inside, made coffee, and spent an hour walking her through the process I'd gone through. I explained about documentation, about understanding the difference between enforceable bylaws and overreach, about when to push back and when to compromise. "The key," I told her, "is to be reasonable but firm. Know your rights, document everything, and don't let them intimidate you." Most HOA boards aren't bad people. They're just used to having more authority than they actually have. Sometimes you have to educate them. Amy left with a folder full of information, and my phone number in case she needed more help. I felt good about being able to help someone else navigate the same kind of situation I'd been through. As the year drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. A simple fence had turned into a legal battle, a neighborhood controversy, and ultimately a learning experience that had changed my perspective on my work and my community. I thought about Patricia's letter and her apology. I hoped she'd found peace wherever she'd moved to. I hoped she'd learned that you can't control everything and everyone, that sometimes you have to let things go. On New Year's Eve, the neighborhood gathered at the community center for a party. It was a casual affair. Families with kids, couples, singles, everyone who wanted to come was welcome. Derek gave a short speech thanking everyone for making it a great year for the neighborhood. As midnight approached, I stood outside on the community center patio with a group of neighbors, watching fireworks in the distance over Denver. Marcus was there, and Frank and Felicity and Helen, and dozens of others I'd come to know over the past few years. "Hey, Quincy," Frank said. "I've been meaning to ask you something. That fence of yours, would you be willing to help me build something similar?" "I'd love to have more privacy in my backyard," I grinned. "Absolutely. We'll pull the permits, measure everything carefully, and build it exactly to code. Perfect. And if anyone complains, then they can talk to the building inspector." "Oh, wait, that's me." Everyone laughed, and as the clock struck midnight and the new year began, I felt genuinely happy. The fence was still standing, the neighborhood was thriving, and life was good. The fence saga had taught me important lessons about standing up for what's right, about the importance of knowing your rights, and about the difference between reasonable rules and unreasonable control. It had also shown me that communities work best when people treat each other with respect and understanding rather than suspicion and hostility. My fence was just 6 feet of cedar planks, but it had become something more than that. It was a reminder that sometimes you have to draw a line, that sometimes you have to say enough and stand your ground. Not because you want conflict, but because there are principles worth defending. As I walked home that night, passing under the streetlights of my quiet neighborhood, I looked forward to many more years in my home, behind my perfectly legal, meticulously built, 6-foot-tall fence. And if anyone ever questioned it again, I had a folder full of documentation and the phone number of a really good lawyer. But I didn't think anyone would. The neighborhood had learned its lesson, and so had I. Sometimes the best defense is simply being right and being able to prove it. Everything else is just noise. The fence stood tall and proud in my backyard, a monument to persistence, legality, and the simple satisfaction of building something well. And every time I looked at it, I smiled.